General Marcus Steinberg adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform as he stepped out of the black Mercedes in front of Buckingham Palace. The autumn morning was crisp, and the golden leaves scattered across the courtyard created a picture-perfect scene. But Marcus wasn't here for sightseeing. As the newly appointed military attaché from the Republic of Valdoria, he had come to London with one clear mission: to assess British military capabilities and report back to his government. At 52 years old, Marcus had built his reputation on being thorough, direct, and uncompromisingly honest in his evaluations. He had served in 3 different conflicts, earned 12 medals for valor, and commanded respect wherever he went. His steel-gray eyes had seen real combat, real soldiers, and real warfare. In his mind, there was a clear distinction between ceremonial pageantry and actual military prowess. The invitation to observe the changing of the guard ceremony had come through diplomatic channels. Marcus viewed it as a perfect opportunity to witness what he privately considered British theater, an elaborate show put on for tourists that had little to do with genuine military readiness. He had read about these guards in his briefing materials: young men in red tunics and tall, furry hats who stood motionless for hours, essentially serving as living statues for the entertainment of crowds. His aide, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, walked beside him, carrying a leather portfolio filled with observation forms and assessment sheets. Sarah was efficient, intelligent, and shared her superior's no-nonsense approach to military evaluation. She had already begun taking notes about the palace's external security arrangements, though she privately wondered if there was much of value to be learned from what appeared to be a tourist attraction. As they approached the palace gates, Marcus noticed the growing crowd of visitors gathering along the railings. Families with children, elderly couples with cameras, and groups of teenagers all jostled for the best viewing positions. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like, which only reinforced Marcus's preconceptions about the entire affair. "Quite the spectacle they put on," Marcus murmured to Sarah, his thick Valdorian accent making the words sound even more dismissive. "I suppose it's good for tourism revenue, but I'm curious to see what actual military value these ceremonial units possess." Sarah nodded, making a note in her portfolio. She had worked with General Steinberg for 3 years and knew his methods well. He believed that military ceremonies should reflect genuine combat readiness, not elaborate choreography designed to impress civilians. In Valdoria, their elite units were known for their practical efficiency, their ability to adapt to real battlefield conditions, and their focus on results rather than appearance. The general had specifically requested this observation opportunity because Valdoria was considering modernizing its own ceremonial protocols. However, his government wanted to ensure that any changes would enhance rather than diminish their military's actual capabilities. Marcus's job was to determine whether the British approach offered any lessons worth learning, or whether it was simply an expensive anachronism maintained for historical reasons. As they waited for the ceremony to begin, Marcus observed the Queen's Guard already in position. The soldiers stood perfectly still, their red tunics bright against the gray stone of the palace. Their famous bearskin hats added nearly a foot to their height, creating an imposing silhouette. But to Marcus's experienced eye, they looked more like museum pieces than active soldiers. "Look at those uniforms," he said quietly to Sarah. "Completely impractical for any real military operation. Those hats would make them perfect targets, and the bright red would be visible from miles away. It's no wonder the British military has struggled in recent conflicts." Several tourists near them glanced over, clearly recognizing from his uniform and bearing that he was a foreign military officer. Marcus straightened slightly, aware that his assessment was being overheard. He had no intention of hiding his professional skepticism. In his view, honest evaluation was more valuable than diplomatic politeness. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Marcus checked his watch and noted that the ceremony was scheduled to begin in precisely 15 minutes. He appreciated punctuality, even in theatrical events, and admitted to himself that the British did seem to run their shows on time. What Marcus didn't know, as he stood there making mental notes about the apparent weaknesses he observed, was that several of the motionless guards had already noticed him. They had identified him as a foreign military officer based on his uniform, posture, and the way he was systematically studying their positions and procedures. More importantly, they had recognized the dismissive nature of his attention. The Queen's Guard were accustomed to being underestimated. Tourists saw them as living dolls. Foreign dignitaries often viewed them as quaint relics. Even some British citizens assumed they were primarily ceremonial soldiers with limited real-world training. But the guards themselves knew better. They understood exactly what they were capable of, and why they had been selected for their positions. As the ceremony was about to begin, Marcus felt confident in his initial assessment. He expected to witness an elaborate but ultimately hollow display of British pomp and circumstance. He planned to write a report describing the ceremony as an interesting historical curiosity, but one with minimal relevance to modern military needs. He had no idea that his own understanding of military excellence was about to be challenged in ways he never could have anticipated. The lesson that was coming would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the relationship between tradition, discipline, and true military capability. The ceremony began with the sound of approaching drums and brass instruments. Marcus watched as the old guard maintained their positions while the new guard approached in perfect formation. The precision of their movements was undeniable, but Marcus had seen precision drilling before. What impressed him in actual soldiers was adaptability under pressure, quick thinking in unexpected situations, and the ability to maintain effectiveness when plans went wrong. As the formal handover proceeded, Marcus found himself studying individual guards more closely. Despite his preconceptions, he had to admit that their bearing was genuinely military rather than merely theatrical. These men maintained their composure with a level of discipline that went beyond simple training. There was something in their stillness that suggested coiled readiness rather than mere statue-like positioning. "The synchronization is remarkable," Sarah whispered, making notes on her tablet, "though I'm still unclear about the practical applications of this type of drilling." Marcus nodded, but privately he was beginning to notice details that hadn't been apparent from a distance. The guards' eyes, while facing forward, were clearly alert and aware of everything happening around them. Their positioning, which had seemed purely ceremonial, actually provided excellent sight lines and coverage of potential approach routes. The spacing between soldiers created overlapping fields of observation that would make it difficult for anyone to approach undetected. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the palace gates. A group of protesters had somehow gotten past the outer barriers and were attempting to rush toward the ceremonial area. They were shouting about some political cause, waving banners, and clearly intended to disrupt the ceremony. The crowd of tourists began to panic, with people pushing and shoving to get away from the disturbance. What happened next completely changed Marcus's understanding of what he was witnessing. The response was immediate, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Without any visible signal or command, several of the Queen's Guard moved into action. Their movements were fluid, precise, and purposeful. The ceremonial soldiers transformed instantly from decorative figures into a highly efficient security team. 2 guards moved to intercept the protesters while maintaining perfect formation with their weapons. Their positioning cut off escape routes while providing clear fields of fire if needed. Other guards smoothly adjusted their positions to maintain security of the ceremonial area while accommodating the response to the threat. The coordination was so seamless that the ongoing ceremony never actually stopped. Marcus watched in amazement as one of the guards, still in his full ceremonial uniform and bearskin hat, quickly and professionally restrained one of the protesters. The soldiers' movements were economical, effective, and clearly based on extensive combat training. The protester, who had seemed aggressive and determined moments before, was subdued and controlled without injury, but with absolutely no possibility of continued resistance. "Did you see that technique?" Sarah asked quietly, her earlier skepticism completely forgotten. "That wasn't ceremonial training. That was advanced close-quarters combat." The most impressive aspect wasn't the individual skills the guards displayed, though those were clearly substantial. It was the way the entire unit had responded as a cohesive whole without any apparent communication. Each soldier had known exactly what to do, when to do it, and how their actions fit into the larger response. The level of training and preparation this implied was extraordinary. As police arrived to take the protesters into custody, the guards resumed their ceremonial positions with the same smooth efficiency they had shown in responding to the threat. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. Tourists who had been panicking moments before gradually calmed down, many of them now looking at the guards with newfound respect and curiosity. Marcus realized that his entire assessment had been wrong from the beginning. These weren't ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were elite troops using ceremonial duties as one aspect of their broader responsibilities. The uniforms that had seemed impractical now revealed their true purpose. They were a form of camouflage, hiding the guards' true capabilities behind a facade of harmless tradition. "General," Sarah said quietly, "I think we need to revise our evaluation criteria." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing as he reconsidered everything he had observed. The precision he had dismissed as mere parade drilling was actually evidence of the discipline required for complex operations. The apparent immobility was really a demonstration of patience and situational awareness. Even the famous bearskin hats, which had seemed purely decorative, served to make the guards appear larger and more intimidating while potentially providing some protection. But the lesson was far from over. As Marcus continued to observe, he began to notice other details that had escaped his attention before. The guards' positions provided overlapping security coverage of the entire area. Their apparent focus on the ceremony masked a comprehensive awareness of everything happening in their vicinity. What he had interpreted as rigid inflexibility was actually disciplined readiness. A senior British officer approached Marcus during a pause in the ceremony. Colonel James Richardson had been observing the foreign general's reactions and had decided it was time for a conversation. "General Steinberg, I believe. I'm Colonel Richardson, commanding officer of this battalion. I couldn't help but notice your interest in our procedures." Marcus straightened and extended his hand. "Colonel Richardson. Yes, I've been observing your ceremony as part of my duties as military attaché. I must say, the response to that disruption was quite impressive." Richardson smiled slightly. "I'm glad you found it educational. Many foreign observers initially underestimate what they're seeing here. They assume that ceremonial duties and combat readiness are mutually exclusive. I'm beginning to understand that assumption might be incorrect," Marcus admitted. "Could you tell me more about the selection and training process for these soldiers?" "Every man you see here has completed advanced infantry training and specialized security courses. Many have combat experience from deployments overseas. The ceremonial aspects are an additional skill set, not a replacement for their primary military capabilities." Marcus felt a growing sense of professional embarrassment as he realized how completely he had misjudged the situation. These soldiers weren't playing at being guards. They were some of the British military's finest personnel, capable of handling both ceremonial duties and genuine security threats with equal professionalism. Colonel Richardson gestured toward the guards who had returned to their positions. "Would you be interested in a more detailed briefing about our selection criteria and training programs? I think you might find it illuminating." Marcus eagerly accepted the invitation, and they moved to a quieter area where they could speak more privately. Sarah accompanied them, her tablet ready to capture what was clearly going to be valuable intelligence about British military practices. "The first thing you need to understand," Richardson began, "is that assignment to the Queen's Guard is considered an honor, not a punishment or a ceremonial dead end. We select from the top tier of our infantry regiments. Physical fitness, mental stability, discipline, and proven combat capability are all requirements." "What about the psychological demands?" Marcus asked, his professional curiosity now fully engaged. "Standing motionless for hours while being photographed and sometimes harassed by tourists can't be easy." Richardson nodded approvingly. "Excellent question. The psychological screening is actually one of our most rigorous requirements. These men must be able to maintain complete composure under stress, ignore distractions, and remain alert for genuine threats while filtering out harmless tourist behavior. It requires a specific type of mental toughness." As they talked, Marcus watched the guards continuing their duties. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the subtle signs of their awareness and readiness. Their eyes moved systematically, checking potential threat areas. Their positioning adjusted slightly as crowds moved, maintaining optimal coverage. What had appeared to be mindless statue-like behavior was actually sophisticated surveillance and security work. "The training process takes 18 months, Richardson continued. 6 months of basic ceremonial instruction, 6 months of advanced security protocols, and 6 months of integrated operations training where they learn to seamlessly combine both skill sets." Sarah looked up from her note-taking. "How do you maintain operational security while being so visible to the public?" "That's one of the most interesting aspects of this assignment," Richardson replied. "The guards become experts at hiding in plain sight. Everyone photographs them, but very few people actually see them. The uniforms and ceremony create a kind of invisibility. People see what they expect to see, rather than what's actually there." Marcus was beginning to understand the genius of the system. The British had created a security force that operated completely in the open, while remaining essentially invisible to potential threats. Enemies would focus on the obvious security measures, the police, the barriers, the technology, while ignoring the highly trained soldiers standing right in front of them. "What about their combat capabilities?" Marcus asked. "How do you maintain those skills while they're assigned to ceremonial duties?" "They rotate through different types of assignments," Richardson explained. 6 months on palace duties, then deployment overseas or to training exercises, then back to ceremonial roles. This keeps their skills sharp, while also giving them experience integrating their ceremonial training with operational requirements. A young guardsman approached and whispered something to Colonel Richardson, who nodded and turned back to Marcus. "It seems there's been another incident. Nothing serious, but it might give you another opportunity to observe our procedures in action." They moved to a position where they could watch as the guards responded to reports of a suspicious package left near one of the tourist areas. Marcus observed the response with new understanding, noting how the soldiers maintained their ceremonial appearance while implementing what was clearly a sophisticated security protocol. The response was multi-layered and comprehensive. Some guards maintained their visible positions to avoid panic among the tourists, while others discreetly moved to secure the area and investigate the potential threat. Communications were handled through subtle hand signals and positioning changes that would be invisible to casual observers, but clear to trained personnel. "The package turned out to be harmless," Richardson said as they watched the all-clear signal being passed among the guards. "But you can see how quickly we can shift between ceremonial and operational modes without causing public alarm." Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about military effectiveness had been challenged by what he'd witnessed. In Valdoria, they prided themselves on practical, no-nonsense military culture. Ceremonial activities were kept to a minimum, and soldiers were taught to focus on substance rather than style. But the British had demonstrated that ceremony and capability could not only coexist, but actually enhance each other. "I have to ask," Marcus said, "how do your soldiers feel about the tourist attention? The constant photography and sometimes disrespectful behavior must be frustrating." Richardson smiled. "It's part of their training to use that attention as an advantage. Every tourist interaction is practice in maintaining composure under pressure. Every photograph is an exercise in situational awareness. They have to remain alert for genuine threats while ignoring harmless distractions." "And the psychological impact on potential enemies? Consider this. If you were planning an attack on a high-value target, would you be more worried about the guards you could see or the ones you couldn't? Our guards are completely visible, but their true capabilities remain hidden. An enemy might plan around what they think they're seeing, only to discover they've completely misunderstood what they're facing." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself completely re-evaluating his understanding of military excellence. The Queen's Guard represented something he hadn't encountered before, a perfect fusion of tradition and modernization, ceremony and capability, visibility and stealth. Sarah had filled several pages with notes and observations. "General, I think our report is going to be very different from what we originally planned." Marcus nodded, feeling both impressed and somewhat humbled by what he'd learned. His confidence in his own assessment abilities had been shaken, but in a way that would ultimately make him a better military officer. The lesson wasn't just about the British approach to ceremonial duties. It was about the dangers of making assumptions based on surface appearances. As the day drew to a close, Colonel Richardson invited Marcus and Sarah to observe the evening changing of the guard. This ceremony was smaller, with fewer tourists, but it gave Marcus an opportunity to focus more closely on the individual soldiers and their techniques. "Before we begin," Richardson said, "I'd like you to meet one of our senior guardsmen. Sergeant Major Thompson has been with the unit for 8 years and has served 3 combat tours." Marcus found himself face to face with one of the soldiers he had been observing throughout the day. Out of his ceremonial position, Thompson was clearly a seasoned professional. His handshake was firm, his bearing confident, and his eyes held the alertness Marcus associated with experienced combat veterans. "Sergeant Major, I've been watching your unit's performance today. I'm curious about your perspective on combining ceremonial duties with security responsibilities." Thompson considered the question carefully before responding. "Sir, I think many people misunderstand what we do here. They see the ceremony and assume that's all there is. But every day we're practicing skills that translate directly to operational environments. Situational awareness, coordination under pressure, maintaining readiness over extended periods, and operating as part of a team without constant communication." "How has your experience here affected your performance in combat situations?" Sarah asked. "The discipline required for ceremonial duties actually enhanced my combat effectiveness," Thompson replied. "Learning to maintain focus and alertness for hours at a time, regardless of distractions or discomfort, is invaluable in the field. And the teamwork skills, being able to coordinate with your unit through subtle signals and positioning, those translate directly to tactical situations." Marcus was struck by something he hadn't considered before. "Sergeant Major, you're telling me that ceremonial training actually improved your combat skills?" "Absolutely, sir. Before this assignment, I was a good soldier. The discipline and precision required here made me a better one. The psychological demands of public duty, maintaining composure under scrutiny, staying alert during routine periods, responding instantly to changing situations, these are exactly the skills needed in combat zones." As they talked, Marcus began to understand that his entire framework for evaluating military effectiveness had been limited. He had always focused on obvious combat indicators: weapons proficiency, physical conditioning, tactical knowledge. But the British had identified and developed subtler capabilities that were just as important: psychological resilience, adaptive thinking, and the ability to maintain peak performance under unconventional stresses. Richardson rejoined them as the evening ceremony prepared to begin. "General Steinberg, I hope today has been educational. I know you came here to assess our ceremonial capabilities, but I suspect you're leaving with insights about much more than that." Marcus nodded slowly. "Colonel, I came here convinced that ceremonial duties were a distraction from real military preparedness. I'm leaving with the understanding that you've created something remarkable, a system that uses ceremony to enhance rather than diminish military capability." "The key insight," Richardson explained, "is that tradition and innovation don't have to be opposing forces. Our ceremonial protocols are hundreds of years old, but we've continuously adapted them to serve modern security needs. The result is a force that honors history while remaining completely contemporary in its effectiveness." As they watched the evening ceremony, Marcus found himself seeing everything differently. The precision wasn't just for show, it was evidence of the discipline required for complex operations. The uniforms weren't just historical costumes, they were psychological tools that served specific operational purposes. The apparent rigidity wasn't inflexibility, it was the visible sign of soldiers who had mastered the ability to maintain readiness under any circumstances. Sarah had stopped taking notes and was simply observing. "General, how do we explain this in our report? Our government expected us to evaluate British ceremonial practices, not discover a new model for elite military training." Marcus considered her question carefully. "We tell them exactly what we've learned. We explain that the British have developed an approach that achieves multiple objectives simultaneously, honoring traditions, providing security, training elite soldiers, and creating psychological advantages over potential enemies." The ceremony concluded as the sun set behind the palace. The guards moved through their final procedures with the same flawless precision Marcus had observed throughout the day. But now he understood that what he was witnessing wasn't a historical reenactment. It was a demonstration of some of the highest levels of military professionalism he had ever encountered. Colonel Richardson walked them toward their waiting car. "General, I hope you'll consider what you've learned here when you return to Valdoria. There may be lessons that could benefit your own military traditions." Marcus shook the colonel's hand warmly. "Colonel Richardson, I came here planning to write a report about an interesting but irrelevant British tradition. Instead, I'm returning home with insights that will change how I think about military excellence. Your soldiers have taught me that true strength sometimes comes disguised as something entirely different." As their car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, Marcus sat in thoughtful silence. His confidence in his own assessment abilities had been shaken, but his respect for professional military service had been deepened. The lesson he had learned wasn't just about the Queen's Guard. It was about the dangers of judging military capability based on surface appearances. "Sarah, when we write our report, I want to recommend that Valdoria send a delegation here for extended observation and training exchange. We have things to learn from this approach." Sarah nodded, still processing everything they had witnessed. "It's remarkable how completely they changed our understanding in just one day." Marcus smiled for the first time since morning. "That, Lieutenant, is exactly why we should never underestimate anyone based on first impressions. The Queen's Guard appeared to be ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They turned out to be some of the finest military professionals I've ever encountered, hiding their true capabilities behind a facade of harmless tradition." As London's lights began to twinkle in the growing darkness, Marcus reflected on the most important lesson of all: that military excellence could take many forms, and the most dangerous enemies were often those who appeared to be something entirely different from what they actually were. The Queen's Guard had taught him that underestimating an opponent based on appearances wasn't just foolish, it could be fatal. His report would reflect not just what he had observed, but what he had learned about the limitations of his own perspective. Sometimes the greatest military victories came not from obvious displays of strength, but from the wisdom to hide true capabilities behind seemingly harmless traditions. The Queen's Guard had mastered this art, and Marcus would never underestimate ceremonial soldiers again.